And this is where the experience begins to change in ways most people are never taught to expect, because the gamma brain state does not simply alter the mind, it transforms the relationship between thought, emotion, perception, and the body itself. I have seen how people spend years trying to force external change while remaining trapped inside the same internal frequency, never realizing that the nervous system responds to emotional patterns long before the conscious mind catches up. When gamma activity becomes stronger in the brain, something remarkable happens. The boundaries between separate regions of thought begin to synchronize. Instead of fragmented mental chatter competing for attention, the brain operates with unusual coherence. Researchers studying advanced meditators, peak performers, and individuals during moments of profound insight have repeatedly observed elevated gamma wave activity connected to heightened awareness, accelerated learning, and intense states of compassion or clarity. But what fascinates me most is not the scientific measurement itself. It is what these states reveal about human potential. Most of us are conditioned to believe that extraordinary intuition belongs only to rare individuals. We assume heightened perception is mysterious or inaccessible, yet the evidence emerging from neuroscience suggests something very different. The brain appears capable of reorganizing itself when emotion, focus, and meaning become deeply aligned. In those moments, perception sharpens beyond ordinary patterns. I believe many people have already experienced fragments of this without recognizing it. There are moments when we suddenly know the answer before logic arrives, times when we sense danger before visible evidence appears. Instances where creative solutions emerge fully formed, as though the mind briefly accessed information beyond ordinary analysis. These experiences are often dismissed as coincidence, yet they point toward an intelligence operating beneath surface awareness. Gamma states seem to amplify access to that deeper layer. What is important to understand is that intuition is not the opposite of science. Intuition may actually represent the brain processing enormous amounts of information at speeds faster than conscious thought can explain. The body continuously absorbs signals from facial expression, tone, movement, memory, environmental change, and emotional energy. Most of this information never reaches conscious awareness, yet under certain states of coherence, the brain integrates these signals into a sudden knowing. This is why emotional regulation becomes so important. Fear fragments attention. Chronic stress locks the nervous system into survival mode. When the body believes it is constantly threatened, the brain prioritizes protection over expansion. Creativity narrows. Perception contracts. The future begins to look identical to the past because the brain becomes addicted to prediction and control. Gamma states emerge more naturally when the body feels safe enough to open beyond survival. Ancient contemplative traditions understood this long before brain scans existed. They discovered that breath, focused attention, stillness, gratitude, and elevated emotional states could shift awareness dramatically. Modern neuroscience now confirms that emotional states directly influence neural firing patterns, hormonal chemistry, immune response, and cognitive performance. The bridge between ancient inner practices and modern biology is becoming impossible to ignore. I have often reflected on how many people unknowingly train themselves into limitation every single day. They rehearse stress mentally before it even arrives. They relive painful memories repeatedly until the body memorizes suffering as a normal state. Eventually, the nervous system stops distinguishing between real danger and imagined fear. The body becomes conditioned to live in anticipation rather than presence. And this conditioning affects far more than mood. Studies involving neuroplasticity demonstrate that repeated emotional experiences physically reshape neural pathways over time. In other words, the emotions we repeatedly embody become biological instructions. This means elevated states like appreciation, inspiration, compassion, and deep focus are not merely pleasant feelings. They are signals influencing the architecture of the brain itself. Gamma activity appears especially connected to moments of integration, where the mind stops dividing experience into disconnected fragments. During these states, people often report feeling unusually present, intensely aware, and deeply connected to life around them. Time may seem slower. Sensory perception becomes vivid, memory improves, learning accelerates. Some individuals even describe profound physical healing occurring alongside emotional transformation. What interests me is how frequently these experiences emerge after people release deeply rooted emotional patterns. The body stores memory in ways we are only beginning to understand. Emotional trauma does not simply disappear because time passes. The nervous system remembers, muscles tighten, hormones adapt, perception changes. Over years, unconscious emotional conditioning can shape personality, health, and even identity itself. But when individuals enter coherent states associated with elevated gamma activity, they sometimes report a sudden interruption in those old patterns. It is as if the brain briefly stops replaying the past and becomes available to an entirely new experience of self. That may be one of the greatest untapped abilities within human consciousness. Not supernatural power, not fantasy, but the capacity to interrupt automatic programming and consciously participate in our own transformation. And once a person experiences even a glimpse of that shift, ordinary life no longer looks the same, because they begin to realize that awareness itself may be one of the most powerful forces shaping human biology, emotion, behavior, and the future direction of our lives. I think this is why moments of silence can feel so uncomfortable for many people. The instant external distraction disappears, unresolved emotional noise rises into awareness. Yet beyond that turbulence is another layer of perception waiting to emerge. The brain was never designed only for repetition and survival. It was designed for adaptation, connection, insight, and conscious evolution. Every time we practice focused attention instead of emotional reactivity, we strengthen neural pathways linked to awareness rather than fear. Over time, small daily practices begin producing measurable biological change. Heart rhythms stabilize, stress chemistry decreases, attention sharpens, and gradually intuition stops feeling like a rare accident and starts becoming a natural extension of a coherent mind operating in harmony with the body in the present moment. In that state, possibility expands beyond conditioning and human perception begins recognizing opportunities previously unseen. Because once the mind begins operating from that level of coherence, we start noticing something even more profound. The external world often reflects the emotional patterns we carry internally. I do not mean this in a mystical or exaggerated sense. I mean that perception itself changes according to the state of the nervous system. Two people can walk through the exact same experience and interpret reality in completely different ways because their brains are filtering information through different emotional conditions. The stressed mind searches for threat. The coherent mind searches for meaning, and this distinction changes everything. When gamma synchronization increases, the brain becomes less trapped inside rigid predictive loops. Instead of reacting automatically from memory, awareness becomes more fluid and responsive. This is why people frequently describe heightened intuition during moments of deep calm rather than moments of panic. Survival thinking narrows perception to immediate danger, while elevated states allow the brain to process subtle patterns that normally remain hidden beneath mental noise. I have often wondered how much human potential remains dormant simply because we rarely enter the conditions necessary for it to emerge. Modern life constantly fragments attention. Notifications interrupt thought before it deepens. Endless stimulation keeps the nervous system externally focused. Many people spend entire days absorbing stress signals from screens, conversations, headlines, and emotional environments without realizing how deeply the body responds to those inputs. Over time, the brain adapts to distraction as its normal state. But the brain adapts to stillness as well. This is what makes focused practices so powerful. Whether through meditation, breath work, visualization, deep contemplation, or intentional emotional regulation, we are training the nervous system to sustain coherence longer than it naturally would under stress. At first, the mind resists. Restlessness appears. Old thoughts surface repeatedly. Emotional discomfort becomes visible. Yet that discomfort is often evidence that unconscious programming is finally reaching awareness. Most people are not actually reacting to the present moment. They are reacting to emotional memories associated with the past. The body remembers rejection, failure, fear, embarrassment, and loss, then projects those experiences into future expectations. Eventually, we stop seeing reality clearly because perception becomes shaped by emotional anticipation. Gamma states appear to interrupt this cycle by increasing integration across different regions of the brain. In those moments, individuals sometimes report feeling unusually free from personal history. The emotional charge connected to old memories weakens. The future no longer feels predetermined. Creativity expands because awareness is no longer trapped inside familiar identity patterns. This may explain why some of humanity's greatest breakthroughs emerged during altered states of deep focus and insight. Inventors, artists, scientists, and visionaries often describe solutions arriving suddenly after periods of intense concentration followed by surrender. The answer appears whole rather than constructed step by step. Neuroscientists studying insight have found bursts of gamma activity occurring immediately before moments of realization. It is as though the brain suddenly unifies scattered information into a larger pattern the conscious mind could not previously perceive. What if intuition is not irrational at all? What if it is accelerated pattern recognition emerging from a deeply coherent nervous system? The implications of this are enormous because it suggests human awareness is far more adaptive than we were taught to believe. It means emotional mastery is not simply about feeling better emotionally. It may directly influence perception, cognition, health, and decision-making at the biological level. I think this is why elevated emotional states matter so deeply. Gratitude, compassion, inspiration, and genuine appreciation are not weak emotions. They are organizing forces within the nervous system. Studies involving heart-brain coherence show that emotional states influence heart rhythms, and those rhythms affect brain function, hormonal balance, and cognitive clarity. When the heart and brain begin operating in synchronized patterns, the body shifts away from survival chemistry and toward restoration and integration. In that condition, intuition often becomes clearer. People suddenly sense which decisions align with their well-being and which do not. Relationships become easier to understand. Destructive habits lose some of their unconscious control. It is not because magic occurred, it is because noise decreased enough for deeper awareness to emerge. And perhaps this is the real transformation humanity is moving toward. Not escaping the body, but understanding it more deeply. Not rejecting science, but expanding our understanding of consciousness through it. For generations, human beings were taught to separate mind from biology, emotion from intelligence, intuition from logic. Yet modern discoveries increasingly reveal that these systems are profoundly interconnected. Thoughts alter chemistry, emotions affect immunity, beliefs shape behavior. Attention changes neural structure. The body is not separate from consciousness. It is continuously responding to it. This realization carries tremendous responsibility because if our internal state influences perception so powerfully, then unconscious fear can distort reality just as strongly as elevated awareness can clarify it. This is why emotional discipline matters, not suppression, not denial. True awareness, the ability to observe thought without becoming imprisoned by it. I have noticed that people experiencing profound inner change often begin describing life differently. They speak less about control and more about alignment, less about forcing outcomes and more about cultivating clarity. The nervous system becomes less reactive, and with that shift comes an entirely different relationship to uncertainty. Fear no longer dominates every unknown possibility. Curiosity begins replacing it. And in that space, the mind becomes capable of perceiving opportunities that stress would have completely hidden. The fascinating part is that these shifts are measurable. Brain imaging reveals structural changes after sustained contemplative practice. Emotional regulation alters neurotransmitter balance. Focused attention strengthens neural networks associated with awareness and empathy. The biology of transformation is becoming increasingly visible through science itself, which raises an extraordinary question. If the brain can reorganize itself through intentional emotional and mental practices, then how much of human limitation is truly fixed, and how much is simply conditioned expectation repeated so many times that it feels permanent? Because the moment a person genuinely experiences heightened coherence within their own mind and body, they begin sensing that consciousness may be far more expansive than conventional thinking has allowed us to imagine. And once that door opens, even slightly, the search for deeper understanding becomes impossible to ignore, because the brain no longer feels like a closed system reacting mechanically to life, but more like a living interface capable of adaptation, insight, healing, creativity, and extraordinary levels of awareness that most people have only briefly touched during rare moments of complete presence and profound inner stillness. And the deeper we explore those states of presence, the more we begin realizing that human consciousness may function less like a fixed machine and more like a dynamic field, constantly responding to attention, emotion, memory, and expectation. This changes the way we understand identity itself, because most people assume personality is permanent, when in reality, much of what we call personality is repeated emotional conditioning reinforced over years of unconscious habit. The brain learns repetition quickly. If we rehearse anxiety daily, the nervous system becomes efficient at producing anxiety. If we repeatedly expect disappointment, the mind begins filtering reality through that expectation. Over time, emotional patterns become so familiar that they feel natural, even when they are limiting us biologically, mentally, and emotionally. But gamma states appear to interrupt automatic familiarity. During moments of heightened coherence, people often describe feeling unusually awake, as though layers of mental fog suddenly dissolve. Old emotional reactions lose intensity. Awareness becomes spacious rather than contracted. The body relaxes while perception sharpens simultaneously. This combination is important because most people associate heightened alertness with stress, yet gamma synchronization demonstrates that intense awareness can emerge alongside deep internal calm. That may be one of the most misunderstood aspects of human performance. Peak states are not always driven by force. Sometimes they emerge through profound alignment. Athletes occasionally call it being in the zone. Artists describe entering creative flow where time disappears. Musicians speak about moments when performance feels effortless and intuitive rather than mentally calculated. Even individuals in emergency situations sometimes report extraordinary clarity, heightened perception, and accelerated thinking under conditions where the brain becomes intensely focused. What connects many of these experiences is synchronization. The mind stops fighting itself. Internal conflict decreases. Attention becomes unified, and when attention fully stabilizes in the present moment, enormous amounts of mental energy become available that would otherwise be consumed by distraction, fear, or emotional resistance. I believe this is why practices involving breath and focused awareness have endured across cultures for thousands of years. Long before neuroscience existed, human beings discovered through direct experience that attention influences physiology. Slow, intentional breathing alters heart rhythms. Focused awareness changes emotional chemistry. Visualization affects the nervous system even when no external event has occurred physically. Modern studies now confirm that imagined experiences can activate many of the same neural pathways as real experiences. The body responds not only to reality itself, but also to the meaning the brain assigns to reality. This explains why chronic fear can exhaust the body even when no immediate danger exists, and why elevated emotional states can sometimes support healing, resilience, and cognitive clarity. The body is always listening to the mind, and the mind is constantly interpreting signals from the body. This relationship forms a feedback loop, shaping perception moment by moment. What becomes fascinating in gamma states is the apparent increase in whole brain integration. Instead of separate regions operating in fragmented isolation, different systems begin communicating more efficiently. Memory, emotion, sensory awareness, and focused attention synchronize into a more unified experience of consciousness. Some researchers believe this integration may play a role in moments of profound insight or expanded awareness. Others suggest gamma activity helps bind separate streams of information into a single coherent perception of reality. Whatever the precise mechanism may be, the subjective experiences reported during these states are remarkably consistent. People feel connected, present, aware, alive in ways difficult to describe through ordinary language. And perhaps this is why so many individuals spend their lives searching for external stimulation without realizing the depth of experience already available within consciousness itself. The modern world offers endless distraction, but very little training in self-awareness. We learn how to consume information, yet few people are taught how to observe thought itself. We learn how to react, but rarely how to become internally still enough to perceive clearly. Stillness is not emptiness. It is heightened sensitivity without internal chaos. When the nervous system becomes less dominated by stress chemistry, subtle forms of perception become easier to notice. Intuition strengthens, emotional awareness deepens, the body communicates more clearly. We begin sensing the consequences of choices before fully experiencing them externally. This is not supernatural ability. It may simply be what human perception naturally becomes when noise decreases enough for deeper intelligence to emerge. And this has profound implications for health as well. Chronic emotional stress affects inflammation, hormonal balance, sleep quality, immune function, and cognitive performance. The body was never designed to remain trapped in constant survival activation. Yet many people unknowingly live in that condition every day, carrying unresolved emotional tension that slowly reshapes biology over time. Gamma-associated practices may help reverse some of that fragmentation by encouraging coherence throughout the nervous system. As emotional regulation improves, the body begins shifting from defense toward restoration. Energy previously consumed by chronic stress becomes available for healing, creativity, focus, and growth. I have often thought about how different society might become if people truly understood the biological power of their inner state. Imagine education systems teaching emotional mastery alongside intellectual development. Imagine children learning how attention shapes the brain before years of stress conditioning accumulate. Imagine healthcare integrating emotional regulation, nervous system balance, and conscious awareness as essential components of well-being rather than secondary concerns. Because consciousness is not separate from daily life. It influences every conversation, every reaction, every decision, every relationship, and every perception of possibility. And perhaps the most extraordinary realization is this: the brain remains adaptable throughout life. Neural pathways continue changing according to repeated experience, focus, and emotional state. This means transformation is not reserved for a gifted few. The capacity for change exists within human biology itself. But accessing that potential requires something many people avoid: sustained self-awareness, the willingness to observe our patterns honestly without immediately escaping into distraction, the courage to recognize how often unconscious fear shapes behavior, the discipline to repeatedly return attention to the present moment until awareness becomes stronger than automatic conditioning. Because eventually there comes a point where a person no longer wants merely to survive familiar emotional cycles. They begin wanting direct experience of a deeper intelligence operating beneath surface thought, an intelligence capable of extraordinary clarity, compassion, intuition, creativity, an inner stability that feels less like something added from outside and more like something ancient within us, finally beginning to awaken after years of noise, fragmentation, and unconscious repetition. And when that awakening begins, even subtly, people often notice a surprising shift in how they relate to reality itself. Situations that once triggered automatic emotional reactions start losing their intensity. The mind pauses before responding. Awareness becomes less impulsive and more observant. It is almost as though an internal space opens between stimulus and reaction, and within that space exists the possibility of conscious choice. That space is powerful because for most of human history, survival depended on rapid emotional responses. The nervous system evolved to detect danger quickly and react immediately, but in the modern world, many of the threats we experience are psychological rather than physical. The body still produces stress chemistry for imagined futures, painful memories, social pressure, and internal fear patterns, even when no immediate danger exists in the present moment. Over time, the brain adapts to that chemistry. Stress stops feeling temporary and begins feeling normal. And when stress becomes normal, people unconsciously organize their identity around it. They expect struggle, they anticipate disappointment, they become emotionally familiar with tension to the point that peace itself can feel uncomfortable. This is one of the hidden consequences of chronic nervous system imbalance. The body starts craving the very emotional patterns that exhaust it, because familiarity creates biological conditioning. Gamma states appear to disrupt this conditioning by introducing heightened coherence into systems that normally operate in fragmentation. During those moments, individuals often report feeling profoundly clear, emotionally centered, and unusually connected to life around them. Instead of perceiving reality through old emotional filters, awareness becomes immediate and direct. I believe this is why moments of genuine presence feel so transformative. For a brief period, the past stops dominating perception. The future stops generating anxiety, and consciousness experiences reality without excessive psychological distortion. Many people spend years searching for meaning externally while remaining disconnected internally. Yet some of the deepest transformations occur not through acquiring more information, but through becoming more aware of the patterns already shaping our thoughts, emotions, and physiology every single day. Awareness changes biology. This is no longer philosophy alone. Neuroscience increasingly demonstrates that focused attention influences neural connectivity, emotional regulation, and even gene expression related to stress and recovery. The body constantly responds to internal states Every repeated thought carries chemical consequences. Every emotional pattern reinforces biological signals that either support coherence or increase fragmentation. What fascinates me is how quickly perception can shift once people begin practicing sustained internal awareness. At first, they notice small changes. They react less automatically. They recover from stress more quickly. Their attention becomes steadier. Then something deeper begins happening. Intuition sharpens. Creative insight increases. Emotional resilience strengthens. The mind becomes less consumed by constant internal noise. And eventually, many individuals describe moments where they feel connected to something far larger than their ordinary identity, not in a mystical sense necessarily, but as a direct experience of expanded awareness beyond habitual thinking. Gamma synchronization may play an important role in these experiences because it reflects unusually high levels of neural integration. Different regions of the brain communicate more efficiently, allowing information to combine into unified perception rather than fragmented processing. In practical terms, this means a person may suddenly perceive relationships, patterns, and solutions that previously remained invisible. This is why elevated states often produce extraordinary creativity. The mind is no longer trapped inside repetitive loops. Instead, awareness becomes flexible and adaptive. And adaptability is one of the greatest indicators of intelligence in both biology and consciousness. I sometimes think about how much human suffering originates from rigid identification with thought. People assume every thought reflects truth simply because it appears in the mind, yet most thoughts are conditioned responses shaped by memory, fear, culture, repetition, and emotional habit. Without awareness, the mind continuously replays familiar narratives until they begin defining identity itself. But consciousness is deeper than conditioned thought. The observer within us can notice the pattern without becoming trapped inside it. And the moment observation becomes stronger than unconscious reaction, transformation begins. This is not instant. It requires practice. The brain changes through repetition, just as conditioning was created through repetition. Every time we return attention to the present moment instead of compulsive mental distraction, we strengthen neural pathways associated with awareness. Every time we interrupt automatic emotional reactions, we reduce the biological momentum of old conditioning. Eventually, the nervous system learns a new baseline. Calm no longer feels unfamiliar. Presence becomes natural. And intuition emerges more consistently because perception is no longer overwhelmed by emotional turbulence. I believe many people underestimate how intelligent the body truly is. The body continuously gathers information beyond conscious awareness. Subtle shifts in tone, expression, movement, energy, and environment are processed constantly beneath the surface. Under stress, much of this information becomes distorted or ignored, but in coherent states, the brain integrates these signals with remarkable efficiency. This may explain why people in highly aware states often sense things before they can logically explain them. Their nervous system detects patterns faster than conscious reasoning can organize into language. What we call intuition may simply be consciousness perceiving reality more completely than analytical thought alone. And perhaps this is why ancient inner disciplines emphasize self-mastery so strongly. Not because emotions are bad, not because thought must be eliminated, but because an undisciplined mind easily becomes controlled by unconscious fear. A coherent mind, however, becomes capable of extraordinary clarity. The deeper lesson here is not about acquiring supernatural ability. It is about remembering the untapped capacities already embedded within human consciousness. The brain is far more flexible than earlier generations believed. Emotional states influence physical health more deeply than most people realize. Attention itself shapes neural structure, perception, and behavior continuously. And when enough coherence develops within the nervous system, people often begin sensing life differently altogether. They stop feeling entirely separate from their experiences and start recognizing how deeply interconnected thought, emotion, biology, environment, and awareness truly are. In those moments, intuition no longer feels mysterious. It feels natural, as though consciousness has briefly returned to a state of alignment that modern distraction, chronic stress, and emotional conditioning caused humanity to forget for far too long, leaving many people disconnected from the deeper intelligence quietly waiting beneath the surface of their own awareness. And the more we reconnect with that deeper intelligence, the more obvious it becomes that human beings were never meant to live in a constant state of internal fragmentation. The mind performs best when thought, emotion, and physiology operate in harmony rather than conflict. Yet many people wake each morning already overwhelmed by unfinished thoughts, emotional residue from the past, and anticipation of future stress before the day has even begun. The nervous system absorbs all of it. Every unresolved emotion influences chemistry. Every repeated fear reinforces neural pathways. Every moment of sustained stress teaches the body to remain alert even in the absence of immediate danger. Over time, this creates a condition where the body memorizes survival as identity. People begin saying things like, "This is just who I am," without realizing that much of what they identify with may actually be learned emotional conditioning reinforced biologically over years of repetition. But gamma-associated states suggest something profoundly hopeful. Human consciousness is not fixed. The brain remains adaptable, and identity itself may be far more flexible than we imagine. I have noticed that individuals who consistently enter states of deep coherence often describe a growing sense of inner spaciousness. Their awareness no longer feels trapped inside compulsive thought patterns. They become capable of observing emotions without immediately becoming consumed by them. This does not mean difficulty disappears from life. It means perception changes. And perception changes experience. Two individuals can encounter identical circumstances while producing completely different biological and emotional responses based on their internal state. One sees only threat and limitation. The other perceives possibility, adaptation, and meaning. The external event may remain the same, but the nervous system interprets it differently. This interpretation shapes reality more than most people realize. Modern neuroscience increasingly reveals that the brain does not passively record the world. It actively predicts, filters, and constructs perception according to prior conditioning, emotional state, and expectation. In other words, we are not simply experiencing reality directly. We are experiencing reality through the lens of our nervous system. And when the nervous system changes, perception changes with it. Gamma synchronization appears connected to moments where those filters temporarily loosen. Awareness becomes less dominated by conditioned prediction and more open to direct perception. This may explain why people often report heightened clarity, expanded creativity, and profound emotional insight during coherent states. For a moment, the mind stops recycling the past, and in that opening, entirely new possibilities become visible. I think this is why practices involving intentional focus can feel so transformative over time. At first, meditation or deep reflection may simply seem calming, but beneath the surface, something far more significant may be occurring. The brain is learning how to stabilize attention. Emotional reactivity decreases. Neural networks associated with self-awareness strengthen. The body gradually shifts away from chronic stress chemistry and toward greater balance. Eventually, awareness itself becomes more refined. People begin noticing subtle emotional patterns before they escalate into full reactions. They recognize how certain thoughts influence physiology almost instantly. They become more conscious of the environments, conversations, and habits affecting their nervous system each day. This level of awareness changes relationships profoundly. Because once people understand how deeply emotional states influence biology and perception, they become less interested in constant conflict and more interested in coherence. They recognize that resentment, anger, chronic fear, and emotional chaos carry physiological consequences extending far beyond temporary mood. The body keeps score of every repeated emotional state, yet the body also responds remarkably to elevated states of gratitude, compassion, inspiration, and purpose. This is one of the most encouraging discoveries emerging from modern mind-body research. Positive emotional states are not merely psychological experiences. They influence heart rhythms, hormonal balance, immune response, and cognitive function in measurable ways. Elevated emotions create internal environments that support greater resilience and integration throughout the nervous system. Gamma activity often increases during these states, not during emotional numbness, not during chronic stress, but during moments of profound engagement, meaning, compassion, creativity, and heightened awareness. that matters deeply because it suggests extraordinary human performance is not solely about intellectual effort, it is also about emotional alignment. The brain functions differently when the body is not trapped in survival mode. Attention expands, learning accelerates. Insight emerges more naturally. Intuition strengthens because awareness is no longer drowned beneath constant internal noise. I believe many people have forgotten what genuine presence feels like because distraction has become the dominant rhythm of modern life. Silence feels uncomfortable. Stillness feels unfamiliar. The moment external stimulation disappears, unresolved emotional patterns rise into awareness, and most people immediately seek another distraction, rather than remain present long enough to observe what is happening internally. Yet transformation often begins precisely there, in the willingness to remain aware without escaping, in the courage to witness our conditioning honestly, in the discipline to repeatedly return attention to the present moment until awareness becomes more powerful than automatic emotional habit. This process gradually changes the brain. Neuroplasticity ensures that repeated states eventually become traits. What begins as a temporary moment of coherence can, through practice, become a more stable baseline for perception and behavior. The nervous system learns calm. The brain becomes more integrated. Emotional resilience increases. And as internal fragmentation decreases, consciousness begins functioning with greater clarity and precision. What fascinates me most is that many individuals who experience these shifts describe a growing sense of connection to life itself. They no longer feel entirely separate from the world around them. Compassion increases naturally. Intuition feels more trustworthy. Creativity becomes less forced and more spontaneous. Even ordinary experiences begin carrying unusual depth and meaning. Perhaps this is what happens when awareness is no longer dominated by constant internal conflict. The mind becomes available to something larger than repetitive survival thinking. And in those moments, people often realize that the extraordinary capacities they once searched for externally may have been quietly waiting within human consciousness all along, hidden beneath layers of stress, distraction, emotional conditioning, and unconscious repetition that kept the nervous system locked into narrow patterns of perception for so long that humanity gradually forgot how expansive awareness can become when the brain, body, and emotions finally begin operating together in true coherence. And when true coherence begins stabilizing within a person, life no longer feels like a constant battle against the world. Instead, there is a growing recognition that much of our suffering originates from resistance within the nervous system itself. We resist uncertainty. We resist change. We resist emotions we do not fully understand. And in that resistance, the body remains trapped in cycles of tension that gradually shape perception, behavior, and even physical health. The brain is always adapting to what we repeatedly feel. If frustration becomes familiar, neural pathways supporting frustration strengthen. If fear dominates attention, the nervous system becomes increasingly efficient at detecting threat. Eventually, the body starts predicting stress before stressful events even occur. People live in anticipation rather than presence, and this anticipation drains enormous amounts of mental and biological energy. But something extraordinary happens when awareness interrupts that pattern consistently. The body begins relearning safety. At first, the shift may seem subtle. Breathing deepens naturally. Sleep improves slightly. Emotional reactions become less explosive. Moments of silence stop feeling threatening. Then gradually, perception itself changes. The mind becomes less consumed by defensive thinking and more capable of observing reality without immediately projecting old emotional patterns onto it. This transformation matters because perception directs behavior. If the nervous system constantly expects danger, people unconsciously limit themselves, they avoid opportunity, they distrust intuition, they cling to familiar emotional patterns even when those patterns create suffering. The brain prioritizes predictability over possibility because survival conditioning values certainty above expansion. Gamma coherence appears to loosen this rigid attachment to familiar emotional identity. People often describe feeling mentally clear in ways they had never experienced before. Thought becomes organized rather than chaotic. Emotional awareness sharpens without becoming overwhelming. Creativity increases because attention is no longer fragmented across countless unconscious fears and distractions. And perhaps most importantly, individuals begin sensing that consciousness itself is not confined to the narrow mental narratives they once believed defined them. This realization can feel deeply liberating. Most people mistake their conditioned thoughts for their authentic self. They assume the constant internal dialogue represents who they truly are. But when the brain enters highly coherent states, there are moments where awareness exists independently from compulsive thinking. The observer becomes stronger than the noise. In that state, people often experience profound clarity regarding their lives. They suddenly recognize unhealthy emotional patterns that previously felt invisible. They sense which relationships drain their energy and which support genuine growth. They become more aware of how environments influence their nervous system. Decisions once clouded by fear become easier because intuition begins operating alongside logic rather than beneath it. I think this integration is essential. True intelligence is not cold analysis disconnected from emotion, nor is it uncontrolled emotional impulse disconnected from awareness. Human consciousness functions best when cognition, emotion, intuition, and physiology communicate coherently rather than competing against one another. This is why elevated emotional states are so biologically important. Gratitude, compassion, inspiration, and deep appreciation help shift the nervous system away from defensive chemistry. When these emotions become genuine rather than forced, measurable changes occur throughout the body. Heart rhythms become more ordered, stress hormones decrease. Cognitive flexibility improves. The brain becomes more receptive to learning, creativity, and insight. Gamma activity often accompanies these integrated states because the brain itself is functioning with greater synchronization. And synchronization changes perception dramatically. Imagine trying to listen to music through severe static. The signal exists, but distortion overwhelms clarity. Chronic stress creates similar interference within consciousness. Thoughts become repetitive, emotions become reactive, attention scatters constantly, intuition weakens beneath the noise. But when coherence increases, the signal becomes clearer. People often report sensing subtle insights before rational analysis catches up. They become aware of emotional undercurrents in conversations. They perceive patterns connecting experiences that once seemed unrelated. Some even describe moments where solutions emerge spontaneously without deliberate effort, as though awareness accessed information beyond ordinary linear thinking. Modern neuroscience suggests that these experiences may involve enhanced integration across brain regions responsible for memory, attention, emotional processing, and sensory awareness. Rather than operating separately, the brain begins functioning as a more unified system. This may be one reason why extraordinary moments often feel deeply meaningful. The mind is no longer fragmented. Awareness becomes whole. And in wholeness, perception expands. I believe humanity has only begun exploring the true implications of this connection between consciousness and biology. For generations, people were conditioned to think of the brain as little more than a biochemical machine reacting passively to external reality. Yet evidence increasingly suggests that attention, belief, emotional state, and mental focus actively influence neural organization and physiological function continuously. The observer affects the experience, not merely philosophically, but biologically. This realization carries enormous responsibility because it means our internal habits matter profoundly. Every repeated emotional state becomes practice for the nervous system. Every thought pattern strengthens specific neural circuits. Every moment of focused awareness either reinforces fragmentation or encourages greater coherence. And over years, these repeated states shape identity itself. What fascinates me is that transformation rarely begins with dramatic external change. It usually begins quietly through awareness. A person notices their breathing for the first time. They observe how certain thoughts create immediate tension in the body. They recognize how compulsive distraction prevents emotional clarity. Small observations gradually accumulate until an entirely new relationship with consciousness begins forming. The process is subtle but powerful. Eventually, people stop asking only how to change their external circumstances and begin asking a deeper question. Who am I beneath conditioned reaction? That question changes everything because it shifts attention away from surface identity and toward direct awareness itself. And once someone genuinely experiences even brief moments where consciousness feels larger than fear, larger than stress, and larger than the emotional patterns they carried for years, Something irreversible often occurs within them. They begin sensing that human potential extends far beyond survival conditioning, beyond repetitive thought, and beyond the limited self-concepts inherited from the past, opening the possibility that intuition, creativity, emotional healing, and extraordinary mental clarity may represent natural capacities of a coherent nervous system rather than rare exceptions available only to a gifted few.
What we have been exploring through the idea of the gamma brain state is not just a neurological curiosity, it is a window into how human experience is constructed moment by moment. To understand this deeply, I want to break it down in a way that feels practical, grounded, and directly connected to daily life. Let's begin with a simple idea. Your brain is not a passive receiver of reality, it is an active prediction system. Every second, your nervous system is asking a silent question. What is happening right now and what does it mean for me? It answers that question using memory, emotion, and pattern recognition. Most of the time, it is not responding to the present moment itself, but to the past being replayed through current conditions. This is why two people can experience the same event and feel completely different realities. One person feels calm, the other feels threatened. One sees opportunity, the other sees danger. The difference is not the event, the difference is the internal state interpreting the event. Now, gamma brain activity appears to be linked with moments where this predictive filtering becomes more integrated and less distorted. Instead of isolated brain regions working separately, emotion in one area, logic in another, memory in another, the system becomes more synchronized. Think of it like a team of musicians suddenly playing in perfect rhythm instead of each playing a different song. When that happens internally, perception becomes clearer. To make this relatable, imagine walking through a crowded street while distracted and stressed. You miss details, you bump into things, your mind is somewhere else. Now imagine walking through the same street in a calm, focused state. You notice facial expressions, sounds, subtle changes in movement. Nothing about the street changed. What changed was your level of internal coherence. This is the foundation of what we are discussing. Gamma states are often associated with moments of heightened awareness, insight, and emotional integration. But the deeper point is not the brainwave itself. The deeper point is what it reflects, a nervous system that is no longer fragmented by internal conflict. Now let's go deeper into why fragmentation happens in the first place. From early life onward, the brain learns through repetition. Emotional experiences become templates. If stress is repeated often enough, the body learns stress as a baseline. If fear is reinforced, the nervous system becomes sensitive to threat even in safe environments. Over time, these patterns become automatic. This is why people often say, "This is just how I am." But in reality, it is often how the nervous system has been trained to respond. Here is where the transformation becomes possible. The brain is plastic. That means it changes based on experience. Every time you interrupt an automatic reaction and return to awareness, you are not just practicing mindfulness. You are physically reshaping neural pathways. You are teaching the brain a new default. This is where gamma-related coherence becomes important in practical terms. It represents a state where different systems in the brain communicate more efficiently. Instead of emotional impulse overpowering logic or logic suppressing emotion, there is integration. You can feel something and understand it at the same time without being overwhelmed by it. Let's translate this into real life. Imagine receiving criticism. In a reactive state, the body tightens immediately. Thoughts race, defensiveness appears. The reaction feels automatic. Now imagine receiving the same criticism in a more coherent state. There is still awareness of the feedback, but there is space before reaction. You can observe your emotional response without being controlled by it. That space is everything. Because in that space, choice exists. Now, how do we begin cultivating this kind of internal coherence in daily life? It does not begin with complexity. It begins with interruption of unconscious patterns. First, breath is one of the simplest tools. Slow, intentional breathing signals safety to the nervous system. It tells the body, right now, you are not in immediate danger. This reduces stress chemistry and allows the brain to function with more clarity. Even a few minutes of controlled breathing can shift internal state significantly. Second, attention training is essential. Most people do not realize how often their attention is fragmented. Constant switching between thoughts, screens, and worries trains the brain into instability. Practicing sustained attention, even on something simple like walking, listening, or observing breath, begins rebuilding neural stability. Third, emotional observation without immediate reaction is key. Instead of suppressing emotion or expressing it impulsively, try noticing it physically. Where does it appear in the body? What changes occur in breathing or muscle tension? This creates separation between I am the emotion and I am aware of the emotion. That separation is where transformation begins. Fourth, reduce unnecessary cognitive noise. The brain cannot maintain clarity in constant stimulation. Periods of silence, even short ones, allow the nervous system to reset. Many insights arise not during thinking, but after thinking stops long enough for deeper processing to occur. Now let's connect this to intuition, because this is where many people become confused. Intuition is often misunderstood as something mystical or supernatural, but in practical terms, it may be the brain processing vast amounts of subtle information faster than conscious reasoning can organize. Your body is constantly reading tone, patterns, microsignals, memory associations, and environmental cues. Most of this never reaches conscious awareness. In coherent states, this information becomes more accessible as a unified sense of knowing. Have you ever met someone and immediately felt comfortable or uneasy without knowing why? That is not random. That is pattern recognition happening beneath language. When the nervous system is calm and integrated, these signals become clearer instead of distorted by fear or stress. This is why highly stressed people often lose access to intuition. Their system is too overloaded to interpret subtle information accurately. Now, the deeper implication of everything we are discussing is this: your internal state is shaping your experience of reality far more than most people realize. Not because external reality is imaginary, but because perception is filtered through biology. Change the biology, and perception changes. Change perception, and life experience changes. This is why emotional mastery is not about positivity. It is about coherence. It is about reducing internal conflict so that awareness can function clearly. Over time, this creates a very noticeable shift in how life feels. Decisions become easier, emotional recovery becomes faster, relationships become clearer, creativity increases, not because external life magically changes, but because the internal system interpreting life becomes more stable. If we simplify everything into one idea, it is this: the more coherent your nervous system becomes, the more accurately you perceive reality. And from that accuracy, better decisions naturally emerge. So the practical path is not to chase extraordinary states. It is to remove internal noise consistently enough that your natural intelligence can operate without distortion. Small daily practices, breathing, awareness, reflection, emotional observation, compound over time. And gradually, what once felt like rare moments of clarity begin becoming a more stable way of being. That is the real shift, not escape from ordinary life, but deeper presence within it. And from that presence, something very subtle begins to unfold. You start realizing that clarity, intuition, and inner stability were never distant abilities to acquire, but natural expressions of a mind and body finally learning to function without internal fragmentation.